We're moving right along. Only two more to go. We got now the top five greatest Utah Jazz, then the greatest Washington Wizards, and this series will be closed, man. This is your first time catching this. I do have the playlist both in the description and the comments. For my list, I'm only using a certain player once. So I used LeBron James only on greatest Cavs. I used Chris Paul on greatest Clippers. It's made the list more interesting. Man, this has been a lot of fun, but we in the home stretch, baby. Let's do it. Now we're on the top five greatest Utah Jazz. We're going to start first with a few honorable mentions. We're going to start with Rudy Goebert. Rudy Goebert, multi-time defensive player of the year. He started to break out as a defensive star in Utah. Now, he's never been a great player. Some people consider him the most overrated player in the NBA today. But at the same time, got to give props where props is due. He's a good defensive player. Is at least worthy of a recognition for one of the best Jazz players as an honorable mention. Another honorable mention, we're going to go with Carlos Boozer from 2004 to 2010 at the Jazz. He's a good two-way player. He's part of that '08 Olympic Redeem team. Few-time All-Star. Never a great player, but a good player for the time it lasted. And as a result, he's at least worthy of an honorable mention. Not quite top five when you look at the 80s and 90s had some of the Jazz best players, but Carlos Boozer was a good player in the 2000s, and those later Jerry Sloan years with the late great head coach helped keep the Jazz competitive post Malone, post Stockton. They stayed in the mix, and Carlos Boozer was a piece of that. Certainly worthy of recognition. The last one is going to go Andrei. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing it right. Andrei Kirlenko. Now, he was one of those European players. Not the first name that comes to mind, but one of the better players in Utah Jazz history. Somewhat of an underrated gem. Not one of the main guys I'm going to talk about, but someone that at least comes to mind as worthy of a recognition. Now, on to the top five itself. We're going to start with Mark Eaton. He was a great defensive player for the Jazz in the 80s. Kickstarted the Malone-Stockton era. He was a two-time Defensive Player of the Year and also a four-time block leader in the 80s. One of those all-time great defensive players that doesn't get the recognition we hear. Often we think of guys like Ben Wallace, Victor Wembanyama, but the best part about doing this series is you get to go back, look back at some of the great defensive names that don't get mentioned. Some of the great offensive players from certain eras don't get mentioned. Mark Eaton, one of the great defensive players in NBA history, one of the all-time great 80s defensive players. Now, he wasn't the greatest all-around player, but he was a great defensive player, one of the best players in Jazz history, and gets the spot at number 5. As a result, now moving on to number 4, go Adrian Dantley. He was a journeyman. He started with the Lakers. Eventually, he was traded to the Pistons, but during that in-between point, his tenure with the Jazz were his best individual years. Multi-time All-Star during that time period. Won a Comeback Player of the Year. He was a 2-time scoring champion, all with the Utah Jazz. And those were easily his best years as a player. He was a major contributor to the Jazz being relevant during that transition from New Orleans to Utah. And as a result, that's why I give him credit as one of the greatest players in that franchise's history. Really worthy of the recognition. Now, moving along. Number 3, Pistol Pete. Pete Maravich. During his tenure with the Jazz, he's a 5-time All-Star and a scoring champion himself. Those great offensive players during his tenure with the Jazz. I mean, you think of I was a member of the Atlanta Hawks, but his years with the Jazz stand out the most. He had his jersey retired by them, and he was one of those all-time great players. One of the main names we think about when it comes to Utah Jazz history. He had one of the coolest nicknames, Pistol Pete. But yeah, one of the, to me, there's only 2 players that could top him. Let's get right into it. Number 2, you got John Stockton. Part of those great teams with Jerry Sloan as the coach during his peak. That was constantly one of the best teams in the West, late 80s into the 90s. The all-time steals leader. A great offensive player, great teammate, great leader. And for that right there, I consider him the number 2. There's only one player above him, and that was one of his teammates, his partner in crime for those 90s Jazz teams. Now, Stockton himself, like I said, great scorer, great steal man, excellent on both sides of the ball, and he played a key contributing role to those 2 finals appearances in the 97 and 98 finals for the Jazz. Everyone remembers the 98 finals with them and the Bulls. Now, unfortunately, the Bulls had their number both times, but, man, John Stockton, one of the lead guys, and one of those great teams that just couldn't win a championship. And certainly, but then, man, there's only one player above him. Now, a lot of us rightfully hate him as a person. We know he's a scumbag as a human. However, as a basketball player, we got to give him props. He was one of the all-time greats. He's easily the greatest Utah Jazz in franchise history. Karl Malone, the mailman, great rebounder, and he was also one of those Iron Men. And what I mean by that is Karl Malone consistently played on the court. You would usually see him up to 75, sometimes 82 games a season. And Karl Malone, so for that, and plus he was a good two-way player. He was the leader for that Utah Jazz team. It was always, he was always, and plus during that tenure, 18 seasons there. He got into the playoffs every season, if I'm not mistaken. Now, granted, they couldn't win a finals. So it's like, look, Karl Malone was a phenomenal regular season player. Think about that. 18 seasons, 18 playoff appearances. And he did get a slight head start on John Stockton being there. So for that, in the all-around dominance on the court during his peak, and for being an Iron Man, I got to give the edge to Karl Malone as the greatest Utah Jazz. Say what you want to say about the man personally. That's another subject for another time. Now, on the court, though, no doubt. Time great. First ballot Hall of Famer. Easily the main guy in Utah Jazz history if you take away his off-the-court issues. So for that, I put Karl Malone as the greatest Utah Jazz of all time. You guys, as always, you're welcome to comment. Give me your top 5 players in Jazz history. Also, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more content. And now we got one more coming up. That'll be the greatest Washington Wizards of all time. So stay tuned.